husband who secretly emptied their $500 million joint account to marry another woman had no idea his divorced wife owned the construction company his parents had worked for their entire lives. But when she discovered the betrayal, what she did didn't just crush him, it crushed them forever. Marcus Chen stood in the marble foyer of what used to be their penthouse, signing the final divorce papers with a smile that never reached his eyes, while his wife of 12 years, Elena Hartwell, watched him with a calmness that should have terrified him. He'd been meticulous, transferring funds in increments small enough to avoid suspicion, building his exit strategy while she built her business empire under a corporate veil he never bothered to look behind. His parents, Thomas and Marie Chen, had given 40 years to Hartwell Construction without ever knowing their daughter-in-law was the silent owner who'd kept them employed through every economic downturn. But Marcus was too busy planning his future with Sophia Laurent, the 26-year-old architect who'd convinced him that his wife's success made him look weak, to notice the dangerous calm in Elena's green eyes. The joint account he'd drained? It was the test she'd set up 6 months ago when she first suspected his affair, filled with money she could lose just to see if he'd take it. The real fortune, the $2.3 billion Hartwell empire she'd inherited and tripled, remained untouched in trusts he didn't know existed. As Marcus handed her the pen, still believing he'd won, still planning the lavish wedding with money he'd stolen, Elena's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. What would Marcus do when he discovered the construction company that employed his aging parents was about to undergo restructuring? How would Sophia react when the stolen $500 million vanished into legal fees and fraud investigations? And what would break first? Marcus's pride, his parents' hearts, or the fragile new life he'd built on betrayal? Elena Hartwell learned about power the day she turned 7 and watched her father's construction empire crumble because he trusted the wrong partner. She remembered standing in their Connecticut mansion while men in suits carried out furniture, her mother's hand trembling in hers, her father's shoulders bent under invisible weight. That memory crystallized into something sharp and unbreakable inside her. A diamond formed under pressure that would define everything she became. 23 years later, she'd rebuilt what her father lost and multiplied it tenfold. But she did it quietly, using her mother's maiden name for the corporate structure, keeping the Hartwell legacy alive behind layers of LLCs and trusts that even her husband never penetrated. Marcus had fallen in love with Elena the architect, the woman who designed sustainable housing projects and spoke passionately about urban renewal at charity galas. He never fell in love with Elena the billionaire because she never told him that version existed. She met Marcus at a construction site in Brooklyn, back when she was still doing field inspections herself, back when the empire was only $800 million strong and growing. He was the site manager for a subcontractor, competent and charming, with eyes that crinkled when he laughed and hands that knew how to build things. His parents worked for one of her subsidiary companies, though she didn't know it then. Thomas Chen ran crane operations and Marie handled procurement logistics, both of them steady, reliable, the kind of employees who became the backbone of any successful company. Marcus had been genuine then, or maybe she'd just been naive enough to believe it. He proposed on the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, and she said yes because she thought she'd finally found someone who loved her for who she was, not what she had. They built a life together, or at least she thought they did, while she quietly ensured his parents never worried about layoffs or pension cuts, never knew their son's wife controlled their professional destiny. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in March. Elena had come home early from a site visit in Boston, still wearing her steel-toed boots and hard hat, covered in concrete dust from inspecting foundation work. She'd found Marcus on the phone in his study, door half closed, voice low and intimate in a way it hadn't been with her in months. "I can't wait until this is over, Soph. Just a few more months and we'll be in Santorini, away from all this." Elena had stood frozen in the hallway, dust from her clothes settling onto their Persian rug like snow. She'd wanted to burst through the door, to confront him, to demand answers. Instead, she'd backed away silently, her architect's mind already calculating angles and load-bearing points, figuring out how much weight this marriage could hold before it collapsed. She hired investigators the next day, not the dramatic kind from movies, but forensic accountants and digital analysts who could track every penny, every message, every hotel reservation. What they found was methodical betrayal. Marcus had been seeing Sophia Laurent for 18 months, the young architect who'd worked briefly on one of Elena's municipal projects before moving to a competing firm. He'd been transferring money from their joint account in $47,000 increments, just under the $50,000 threshold that would trigger automatic alerts she'd set up years ago for security purposes. The joint account had been her father's idea, actually, advice he'd given her mother weeks before he died of a heart attack in a hospital that might have saved him if they'd still had the money for better care. Keep some money together, he'd wheezed, oxygen mask fogging with each word. But never everything. Trust but verify. Love but protect yourself. Elena had put $500 million in that joint account, enough to seem like their combined marital wealth, enough to test if Marcus was who she hoped he was. Her real fortune, the $2.3 billion Hartwell construction empire, remained in irrevocable trusts under her mother's name, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Marcus had never asked about the corporate structure of her consulting work. He'd been too busy spending her money and planning his exit. She watched him for 6 months after that phone call, playing the role of the unsuspecting wife while her team documented everything. She attended his company dinners and smiled at his colleagues who pitied her. The wife who didn't know her husband was checking his phone constantly for messages from someone else. She even met Sophia once, at an industry mixer in Manhattan, and shook the younger woman's hand while Sophia's eyes glittered with secret triumph. "Your husband speaks so highly of you," Sophia had said, her French accent adding elegance to the lie. "He says you're very focused on your work." "I am," Elena had replied, holding her wine glass steady. "I believe in building things that last. Foundations matter more than facades, don't you think?" Sophia had laughed, missing the edge in Elena's tone entirely. Marcus had missed it too, standing beside his mistress with his hand on Elena's back, playing the devoted husband while planning their destruction. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday, delivered by Marcus himself with rehearsed solemnity. They were sitting in the penthouse living room, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Manhattan skyline, like a painting of everything they'd supposedly built together. "I'm not happy, Elena. I haven't been for a long time." Marcus delivered the lines like he'd practiced them. And maybe he had. Maybe Sophia had helped him write this script. "We've grown apart. You're married to your work, and I need someone who can be present." Elena had watched him, this man she'd loved for 12 years, and felt something close to pity. He looked so confident, so certain he'd executed the perfect escape. The divorce papers were generous by normal standards. He was asking for half of the joint account, the penthouse, and monthly alimony that would have bankrupted most people. He'd left her the consulting business he thought was worth maybe $30 million, not knowing he was leaving her the empire that employed 40,000 people, including his parents. "There's someone else," he'd admitted, and at least he had the grace to look slightly guilty. "Her name is Sophia. I didn't plan this, Elena, but we fell in love. These things happen." "These things happen," Elena repeated softly, signing the papers without argument, without asking for anything more. Her lawyer had looked at her like she'd lost her mind, but Elena knew exactly what she was doing. Marcus wanted the money in the joint account. He could have it. Every penny he'd stolen plus half of what remained. She'd even thrown in the penthouse, the cars, the vacation home in the Hamptons he loved so much. Marcus had looked almost disappointed by how easy it was. Maybe he'd wanted a fight, wanted drama to justify his betrayal. Instead, he got Elena's signature and her calm acceptance, which somehow made him more defensive. "My parents don't know yet," he'd said, gathering the papers. "About Sophia, I mean. They still think we're working things out. Thomas and Marie are good people," Elena had said, and it wasn't manipulation, it was truth. She'd reviewed their employment files personally, had approved their pension increases, had made sure they were transferred to easier positions as they aged. "They've worked hard their whole lives. They deserve security. They'll be fine. They've got good jobs, solid company." Marcus had smiled then, relieved. That Hartwell construction place treats their employees well, actually. Mom's always talking about how secure she feels there. Elena had nodded, sipping her wine, watching her soon-to-be ex-husband plan his future on stolen money without realizing he was describing her company, her legacy, her power. The irony was so perfect it almost made her laugh. "When's the wedding?" she'd asked. "June. Santorini. Sophia's always dreamed of a Greek island wedding." He'd actually looked excited, like a child planning Christmas morning. "We're going to travel for a year after that. She's always wanted to see the world." "That sounds lovely," Elena had said. "I hope you'll both be very happy." And she'd meant it, in a way, because their happiness was going to make what came next so much more devastating. The day after the divorce was finalized, Elena walked into the headquarters of Hartwell Construction for the first time as its acknowledged owner. She'd been running it from the shadows for years, but now she wanted everyone to know exactly who held the reins. The board of directors had assembled in the top-floor conference room, men and women who'd worked with her for years without knowing her married name, without connecting Elena Hartwell, the CEO, to Elena Chen, the recently divorced wife of Marcus Chen, whose parents worked in their logistics division. "We need to restructure," Elena announced, laying out architectural plans and financial projections across the mahogany table. "The market's shifting towards sustainable development, and we're going to lead that shift. That means closing outdated facilities and investing in new technology." Robert Jameson, her CFO, adjusted his glasses nervously. "The Newark facility? That's been operational for 30 years. We've got legacy employees there, people who've been with us since your father's time." "I know exactly who works there," Elena said quietly. "Thomas Chen, crane operator, 40 years of service. Marie Chen, procurement specialist, 38 years, both eligible for early retirement with full pension benefits if we close the facility." She'd done the math carefully. The Newark facility was actually profitable, but it was also where Marcus's parents had built their careers, where they'd formed friendships and found purpose. Closing it wouldn't destroy them financially, she'd make sure of that, but it would shatter the routine and stability they'd built their lives around. At 63 and 61, they were young enough to feel lost without work, but old enough to know starting over was nearly impossible. "We're offering enhanced retirement packages," Elena continued, sliding folders across the table. "Full pension, health care, and severance bonuses for anyone over 60 with more than 20 years of service. But we need to move quickly. The closure will be announced in 2 weeks." Her hands didn't shake as she signed the orders. This was business, she told herself, just business. The fact that it would devastate Marcus's parents would make them question everything as they watched their workplace of 4 decades shut down was simply coincidental. The fact that Marcus would have to watch his parents struggle with purposelessness and early retirement while he'd planned to travel the world on stolen money was just karma. But late that night, alone in her new apartment overlooking Central Park, Elena pulled out an old photo album and found pictures from their wedding. Thomas and Marie Chen smiled in the front row, Marie's eyes wet with happy tears, Thomas's hand gripping his son's shoulder with pride. They'd welcomed Elena into their family without hesitation, had taught her to make Thomas's grandmother's dumplings, had told her stories about Marcus's childhood that made him seem more human, more real. She closed the album and poured herself a scotch, the expensive kind Marcus used to buy for celebrations. The apartment was quiet except for the muted sounds of the city below, and for the first time since she'd found out about the affair, Elena let herself feel the weight of what she was doing. Her phone buzzed with a message from her investigator. Marcus had just put a deposit down on a yacht charter in Greece, a $180,000 charge to an account funded by money he'd stolen from her. Sophia had posted photos on social media of her wedding dress shopping, a Vera Wang gown that cost more than most people's cars. Elena's moment of doubt evaporated. She opened her laptop and began drafting the next phase, the one that would make the facility closure look gentle by comparison. The email hit Marcus's inbox on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, while he and Sophia were having breakfast in the penthouse he'd won in the divorce. "Urgent. Fraud investigation," read the subject line, sent from the legal department of Citibank, where the joint account had been held. Marcus had been stirring sugar into his coffee when he opened it, and his hand froze mid-rotation as he read. The bank had flagged unusual withdrawal patterns from the joint account in the months leading up to his divorce. They were cooperating with federal investigators who'd subpoenaed records showing systematic transfers that appeared designed to evade detection. The email concluded with a notification that all accounts associated with his name had been frozen pending investigation. "What's wrong?" Sophia looked up from her phone, where she'd been posting photos of their breakfast with hashtags about Dorama new beginnings and Amrasar, true love. Marcus couldn't speak. His mind was racing through every transfer, every careful calculation he'd made to stay under the radar. He'd been so certain he'd covered his tracks, had even consulted with a shady accountant who'd assured him that as long as he stayed under $50,000 per transaction, he'd be fine. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Elena had designed that $50,000 threshold specifically for him. She'd set it high enough to make him feel safe, to let him steal enough to feel confident, while her forensic accountants tracked every transaction from day one, building an airtight case. The moment the divorce was final, she'd handed everything to federal prosecutors with a bow on top. Evidence of wire fraud, tax evasion, and asset concealment that carried sentences of up to 20 years. His phone rang. His father. Marcus almost didn't answer, but guilt, or maybe habit, made him hit the green button. "Marcus!" Thomas Chen's voice sounded 20 years older than it had last week. "Did you know about this? About the facility closing?" Marcus's stomach dropped. "What facility?" "Newark, Hartwell Construction. They're shutting us down, son. Your mother and I, we're out of work. After 40 years, we're just done." There was a pause, the sound of traffic in the background, like his father was calling from the parking lot because he couldn't bear to go home with the news. "They're calling it restructuring. Gave us 2 weeks' notice and a retirement package. We're too young to retire, Marcus, but too old to start over." "Dad, Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd never paid attention to where his parents worked, had barely registered the name of the company. Hartwell Construction, Hartwell. Like Elena's last name, the one she'd kept for professional reasons. "Your mother's crying," Thomas continued, his voice cracking. "She's in the bathroom at work, crying. She loved that job, loved those people. We had plans, Marcus. We were going to work 5 more years, pad our retirement, finally take that trip to China to see where your grandparents came from. Now we're just obsolete." Marcus ended the call with promises he didn't know how to keep and stared at his laptop screen, at the frozen account notification, at the investigation letter. Beside him, Sophia was still scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the walls closing in. "Babe, we need to talk about the wedding budget," she said, looking up with a pout. "The florist is saying roses are going to be more expensive than we thought. Maybe we should access some of your other accounts." "There are no other accounts," Marcus whispered. "There's nothing left." He opened his banking app with shaking fingers and confirmed what the email had told him. Every account was frozen. The $500 million he'd methodically stolen, the money he'd thought was his ticket to freedom, was locked away behind legal holds and federal seals. The small account he'd kept separate, his original savings from before the marriage, held $43,000, enough to live on for a few months if they were careful. Nowhere near enough for Greek island weddings and year-long travel adventures. Sophia was talking, her voice rising in pitch, but Marcus wasn't listening. He was thinking about his parents, about Elena, about Hartwell Construction. He pulled out his phone and searched for the company's website, something he'd never bothered to do before. The About Us page loaded, and there at the top was a photo of the executive team. CEO Elena Hartwell, his wife, his ex-wife, the woman he'd betrayed and dismissed as too focused on her consulting work. The woman who'd signed the divorce papers without fighting, who'd let him take the penthouse and the cars and what he thought was half their fortune. The woman whose father had founded one of the largest construction companies on the East Coast, who'd rebuilt her family's empire while he was sitting in site manager meetings, clueless. Marcus stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He opened his laptop and started searching, really searching, for Elena Hartwell. Forbes articles about the woman rebuilding sustainable urban housing. Business Insider profiles of billionaire developer Elena Hartwell's secret to success. Wall Street Journal analysis of how Hartwell Construction became an industry leader. $2.3 billion. The number appeared again and again. Not $500 million. That had been pocket change, a test, money she could afford to lose just to see what he would do. The real fortune, the one she'd inherited and grown, had been invisible to him the entire time they were married because he'd never bothered to look beyond what she chose to show him. He'd stolen from a billionaire who employed his parents, divorced the woman who'd kept them safe through recessions and market crashes, all to marry someone who was currently complaining about flower arrangements they could no longer afford. "Marcus, are you listening to me?" Sophia's voice cut through his spiral. "What do you mean there's no money?" He turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw for the first time what Elena must have seen, a beautiful facade with no foundation, a relationship built on stolen money and lies, a future that was already crumbling. His phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. He answered it anyway because everything was already falling apart. "Mr. Chen, this is Agent Patricia Morrison with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We need to schedule a time for you to come in for questioning regarding suspicious activity on account number ending in 7734. You're not under arrest at this time, but I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel." Marcus hung up without responding. The penthouse suddenly felt like a prison, all marble and glass and expensive furniture he'd demanded in the divorce. From the bedroom he could hear Sophia on her phone, probably calling her friends to complain about the morning's disruptions. Through the windows, Manhattan stretched out beneath them, thousands of buildings that Elena's company had probably worked on. A city she'd helped build while he was planning to tear apart their marriage. He thought about his parents in Newark, packing up 40 years of memories and photographs from office walls. He thought about Elena signing those papers with steady hands, letting him think he'd won. He thought about the upcoming federal investigation, the legal fees that would consume that last $43,000. The wedding that would never happen, the life he'd imagined evaporating like morning mist. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The facility closure is business, Marcus. The investigation is justice. What comes next is mercy. For your parents, not for you. They'll be taken care of. You won't be." Ener. Marcus sank to the floor of the penthouse he'd stolen, in the marriage he'd destroyed, with the future he'd gambled away for a lie. Outside, the city hummed with activity, construction cranes dotting the skyline like monuments to Elena's empire, building things that would last long after his betrayal was forgotten. He'd wanted to crush her with his betrayal, to take everything and leave her broken. Instead, she'd let him take just enough rope to hang himself, and now he was dangling, watching everything fall away, realizing too late that he'd never been fighting someone in his weight class. The construction company his parents worked for, the fortune he'd thought he'd stolen, the wife he'd underestimated, it had all been Elena's, and what she'd done hadn't just crushed him. It had crushed them forever. Every plan, every dream, every future he'd built on sand instead of foundation. And the cruelest part was knowing she'd tried to teach him that lesson on their very first date. When they'd stood on a Brooklyn construction site and she'd told him that good architecture was about more than just surface beauty, it was about building something strong enough to weather any storm. He'd thought he was the storm. He'd never realized he was just debris in her wind.